"Please, let me die," she whispered, but the Apache held her tight and changed everything. The hot sun beat down relentlessly over the dry, cracked earth of the desert. The air shimmered with heat, making it almost impossible to breathe, and the only sounds were the soft rustling of the wind through the sparse bushes and the distant calls of desert animals. For the Apache woman, it was an all-too-familiar landscape, one that carried the weight of her painful past and the present torment of her captivity. She had been captured during one of the many raids between her people and the settlers. It wasn't the first time she had been taken. She had seen many of her people fall into the hands of those who would enslave them or kill them. But this time, it felt different. The wounds on her body, deep and raw, were a constant reminder of the violence she had endured. Her heart felt as though it was shattered into 1,000 pieces, and with each passing day, the thought of escape seemed less and less likely. As she lay bound to a makeshift cot under the open sky, her body aching and fevered, the pain overwhelmed her. Her mind swirled with thoughts of death. She could feel herself slipping away, her consciousness drifting in and out. She didn't want to fight anymore. She didn't want to suffer. For once, she just wanted peace. "Please, let me die," she whispered, barely able to hear her own voice over the wind. It was a simple plea, a fragile whisper carried by the desert's wind to no one in particular. She wasn't sure if the man who had captured her could hear her or if he cared at all. But in that moment, all she wanted was for it to be over. The pain, the helplessness, the constant fear, she couldn't take it anymore. She had been left alone under the blazing sun, the air heavy with dust and the smell of sweat. She wasn't sure how long she had been lying there, but it felt like an eternity. The thirst was unbearable, and her throat was so dry that it seemed impossible to swallow. The heat had drained her energy, and the coolness of the night seemed so far away. Every inch of her body ached, and she wondered if she would survive another night under the harsh desert sky. It was then that she heard the soft, steady footsteps approaching. The sound was so faint at first that she almost didn't believe it. But then they grew louder, closer. Her heart fluttered, an instinctive reaction of fear. But she didn't have the strength to move, to try and fight. She could only lie there, her body too weak to do anything but wait for whatever fate had in store. The man who approached was unlike any other she had seen before. He wasn't one of the rough soldiers or settlers who had taken her, but something about him felt different. His movements were steady, measured, and when he knelt down beside her, he didn't speak. He just looked at her, his dark eyes filled with an unreadable emotion. At first, she didn't understand what he was doing. He didn't tie her up more tightly or brandish a weapon. Instead, he reached for the small canteen at his side and, without saying a word, gently lifted it to her lips. She recoiled at the thought of drinking from him, a man who had once been her captor, the man responsible for bringing her to this place. But the thirst was unbearable, and her pride had long since withered away. She reluctantly accepted the water, her cracked lips parting just enough to allow the cool liquid to touch her parched throat. It felt like heaven, but it was only temporary. Her body was still broken, and her spirit was just as shattered. He didn't ask her anything. He didn't force her to speak. There were no demands, no threats, just quiet, calm, and the gentle rhythm of his breath. For a moment, she felt as though she might have imagined the whole thing, that this was just a dream or a hallucination. But when she tried to move again, she found that she couldn't, not because she was bound, but because he was holding her still with a strength that she couldn't quite understand. His touch was surprisingly gentle. He wasn't rough with her, despite the situation. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. The way he carefully arranged her blankets, adjusted her position to make her more comfortable, and even covered her with a cloth to shield her from the sun, it all spoke of a tenderness she had never expected from him. This wasn't the cruel, cold captor she had been preparing herself to endure. The Apache woman felt a strange confusion fill her chest. She didn't understand why he was doing this. He wasn't like the others. He didn't seem to take pleasure in her suffering, nor did he appear to want anything from her other than to make her as comfortable as possible in her weakened state. She couldn't reconcile the man before her with the one who had taken her prisoner, who had helped bring about the ruin of her life. For a long time, neither of them spoke. She didn't have the strength to speak, and he didn't seem to want to either. The silence between them grew heavy, but somehow it was comforting. It was almost as though they didn't need words. In that moment there was a quiet understanding between them, something unspoken but felt deeply. After a while he stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. She thought he was going to leave her there to suffer once more under the sun's unrelenting gaze. But instead, he did something unexpected. He moved to the shade of a nearby rock, a small shelter from the brutal heat, and returned with a bundle of herbs. With careful hands he crushed them into a small paste and applied it gently to her wounds, his touch careful, almost reverent. It stung, but the coolness that followed brought some relief. For the first time in a long while, she let herself relax just a little. She couldn't explain it, but something in her heart shifted. The man who had once been her captor was now her caretaker. It was a paradox she couldn't quite grasp, and yet she didn't resist. Her body ached, her mind was weary, and her heart was torn, but in his presence she felt a strange sense of safety. As night fell and the desert grew cold, he stayed by her side. He didn't speak, but he made sure she had enough water to drink and kept the fire going, the warmth spreading through the air. She watched him for a long time, studying his face, searching for any sign of the cruelty she had come to expect from her captors. But she found none. He was a mystery, and she could not make sense of him. All she knew was that she had never felt so vulnerable and yet so oddly secure. "Why?" she finally whispered, her voice weak and raspy. She didn't know what she was asking, but the question seemed to hang in the air between them, unanswered. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he simply looked at her, his dark eyes steady. There was no pity there, no anger, just quiet resolve. After a long silence, he finally spoke, his voice low and calm. "You're not meant to die here," he said softly. Not today. She didn't understand. Why had he saved her? Why had he even bothered? But in that moment, none of it seemed to matter anymore. She was alive, and for the first time in a long time she allowed herself to feel the smallest glimmer of hope. The days passed slowly, each one feeling like a lifetime in the desert. The Apache woman found herself slowly recovering, though it was hard to tell if the pain she felt in her body was outweighed by the confusion and questions swirling in her mind. The man, her captor, had become something entirely unexpected. He had shown her kindness in ways she never imagined. At times, when she was too weak to move, he would bring her water or tend to the fire, and each time she couldn't help but wonder why. Why was he doing this for her? What did he expect in return? She didn't know if she could trust him yet. He was still the man who had captured her, who had dragged her from her home, and who had, in many ways, stolen the future she once had. But in these quiet moments, she couldn't deny that he was different from the other men who had come before him. There was something about him, something that made her hesitate before raising her guard completely. She had seen his face at its most vulnerable, as he worked tirelessly to ensure her survival, but that didn't erase the hatred and pain she felt for everything he represented. He was the enemy after all, and no matter how many acts of kindness he showed, she could never forget that. Despite the strange connection that seemed to be growing between them, the Apache woman still found herself struggling against the pull of the past. She had grown up in a world of conflict and violence, where survival came at the cost of compassion. Her tribe had been fighting for their land, their way of life, for as long as she could remember, and she had been taught to see the settlers, like the man who was now tending to her wounds, as the enemy. It wasn't just a matter of politics. It was personal. Her people had lost everything: their homes, their families, their freedom. But in the days since her capture, something had begun to shift within her. She noticed things about the man that she hadn't before. When he thought she was asleep, he would stare out into the desert with a faraway look, as though the land held some deep meaning for him. At times, she caught glimpses of a sadness in his eyes, a sadness that mirrored her own. He had suffered too. She didn't know how, but she could see it in the way he carried himself, the weight of a past he couldn't escape, a past that had shaped him into the man he was now. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desert floor, the Apache woman found herself unable to remain still. The ache in her body was still there, but there was a restlessness growing inside her, a hunger for something more. She wasn't sure what it was. A sense of freedom, perhaps, or maybe a desire for something different from the life she had known. She could no longer stay silent, watching the man take care of her without any understanding of why. She had been thinking about him all day, watching him from the corner of her eye as he worked, silently, methodically, almost as if he were lost in his own thoughts. She couldn't take it anymore. The questions burned inside her, and she finally spoke. "Why do you help me?" Her voice was weak, but the words came out with a force she didn't expect. The question had been building inside her for days, and now, at last, she had asked it. The man stopped what he was doing, looking up at her, his dark eyes meeting hers. For a moment there was silence, and she felt a pang of regret for speaking at all. What if he didn't answer? What if he just left her here to die, as he had every right to do? But instead of walking away, he sat down next to her, his expression unreadable. He looked out at the horizon for a moment, the fading light of the day casting a soft glow on his face. She couldn't help but notice the lines of weariness etched into his features, as though the years had taken their toll on him in ways that couldn't be hidden. "I've seen too much death," he said quietly, his voice low and rough. "Too much loss. I don't want to add to it." He turned back to her, his eyes searching hers.
It's not about you or me. It's about what we do with what's left of our lives.
The words hung in the air, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. She had never heard anyone speak like that before. In the world she had known, survival was all that mattered. There was no room for anything else. But this man, it was different. His words held a truth she couldn't deny, a truth she wasn't ready to face. "You could have left me to die," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "You should have." "I'm nothing to you." His eyes softened, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something that wasn't cold or distant. "Maybe," he said, "but I've learned that nothing is ever that simple." She was silent, unsure of what to say. What was he asking of her? Was he asking her to forgive him? To accept him as something other than an enemy? Or was he simply offering her something that she couldn't quite understand? Days turned into weeks, and as the Apache woman slowly regained her strength, the bond between her and the man deepened in ways neither of them expected. The long, quiet hours spent in the desert, watching the sun rise and set, had a strange way of changing things. There was something in the solitude that allowed them to open up in ways they might not have been able to do in the chaos of the world they once knew. They spoke little, but when they did, it felt as though they were sharing pieces of themselves that they had long since buried.
The Apache woman found herself struggling with her feelings for him.
How could she feel anything but anger toward the man who had torn her life apart? How could she forget the pain and fear that had marked every moment of her captivity? Yet the more she saw him, the more she understood the depth of his loss, his regrets, and the quiet honor he carried within him. The more she realized that he wasn't the enemy she had once believed him to be. She didn't know what he was, but she knew he was no longer just the man who had captured her. He had become something else entirely. The time came when the Apache woman could stand on her own again, her strength returning with each passing day. She could feel the change within her, the shifting of her heart and mind. But even though she was stronger, even though her body no longer felt like it was falling apart, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. There was an emptiness inside her, a longing for something that she couldn't quite name. And as the days stretched on, she began to realize that the answer was not something she could find in the desert or in the man sitting beside her. It was something she would have to find within herself. But for now, she wasn't ready to face it. For now, she would simply stay by his side, learning to trust him, learning to trust herself, and waiting for the moment when she could finally face the truth. The days that followed seemed to blur together, each one indistinguishable from the next. The sun continued to beat down relentlessly during the day, and the nights grew cold, the temperature dropping drastically as the stars filled the sky. Despite the harshness of the desert, There was a strange calm between them, a quiet understanding that neither of them had expected. The Apache woman had grown stronger, her wounds healing with each passing day, but her heart and mind were still in turmoil. The more she spent time with him, the more confused she became. The man who had captured her was no longer a figure of fear in her eyes. He had become something entirely different, though she wasn't sure what that was yet. His actions, his care for her, spoke of a depth she couldn't fully understand. His quiet presence, his willingness to stay with her, even when there was no reason to, was something she had never encountered before. She wasn't sure if she could trust him completely, but with every passing day, her walls began to crumble just a little more. There were moments when they spoke, but most of the time they sat in silence. It was a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, just peaceful. She had always been a woman of few words, and so had he. When he did speak, his voice was calm and steady, often sharing small details of his past, things he had done, people he had known. Sometimes he would tell her about the land, how he had come to know it so well. The desert was harsh, but it had a kind of beauty that he had learned to appreciate. He spoke of the animals that roamed it, the way the sky shifted from blue to orange to purple, and how the stars looked different from anywhere else. The Apache woman, though quiet herself, couldn't help but listen. She didn't understand everything he said, but his words had a way of painting pictures in her mind. She had grown up in a different world, a world where every moment was about survival, where beauty was something that had no place in a life filled with conflict. To hear him speak of the desert as if it were a part of him, something he cared for deeply, was both strange and comforting. One evening, as the sun began to set, they sat together on the edge of a small hill overlooking the vast stretch of sand. The air was cool, the breeze gentle, and for the first time the Apache woman didn't feel the sharp sting of pain in her body. She was healing, but more importantly, she was beginning to heal in a way that went beyond her physical wounds. She looked at him as he sat beside her, his posture relaxed but watchful. His face, though weathered by time, still held a quiet strength. There was something about him, something that made her wonder if there was more to him than she had ever imagined. "You never talk about yourself," she said softly, the words feeling strange coming from her mouth. It was the first time she had asked him anything personal, but the question had been bubbling inside her for some time. "Where did you come from? Who are you really?" He turned to her, his dark eyes meeting hers. For a moment it seemed as though he was going to brush off the question, as if it were too difficult to answer. But then he exhaled deeply, his gaze shifting to the horizon. "I'm just a man trying to survive," he said quietly, his voice low but steady. "I don't know if I'm anything more than that, but I've seen enough to know that nothing lasts forever. People don't last forever. Places, memories, all of it fades away eventually." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The Apache woman didn't know what to say at first. She had spent so much of her life fighting against what seemed like an inevitable end. She had learned to hold on to what little she had, to protect herself from the world around her. But what he said resonated with her in a way she couldn't explain. She understood in some strange way that he had experienced loss, not just the loss of people, but the loss of something deeper, something intangible. "Have you ever had something you cared about, something you wanted to protect?" she asked, her voice softer now, as if testing the waters. He looked at her then, a flicker of something in his eyes. It was brief, but she caught it. For a moment he seemed distant, lost in a memory. Then he nodded. "Once," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of sorrow. "But things change. People change. You have to learn to let go, or you'll drown in it." The words were simple, but they held a depth of meaning that was hard to ignore. The Apache woman felt a pang in her chest. It was as if, in that brief exchange, she had learned something new about the man beside her. Something that made him more human, more real, than just the enemy she had once thought he was. She didn't know how to respond to him. She couldn't bring herself to say that she understood. She couldn't say that she had ever experienced what he had. But there was a bond between them now, something unspoken, but undeniable. She didn't know what it was yet, but it was there. The next few days passed in a blur. The man continued to care for her, always bringing her water, tending to the fire, and keeping watch over her while she slept. And she, in turn, grew stronger, both physically and mentally. She began to feel as though there was something more to this strange arrangement between them, something that was not just about survival. There was something else, something that made her want to stay, to learn more about him, even though she still didn't fully understand the complexities of their situation. One evening, as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, he spoke again, his voice breaking the silence that had fallen between them. "I used to have a family," he said, his words heavy with a sorrow she had never heard in his voice before. "I had a wife, children, a life that was peaceful. But peace doesn't last. It's always taken away, in one way or another. So you learn to survive. You learn to live with the memories, even when they hurt." The Apache woman's heart ached as she listened to him. She had heard stories of men who had lost everything, but hearing him speak so openly about it felt different. There was a vulnerability in his words, a raw honesty that she hadn't expected. "I'm sorry," she said softly, not knowing if that was enough. "For what you lost." He nodded, his gaze distant. "It's not your fault," he said, his voice steady. "I just want to make sure that I don't lose more." "That's why I'm here, to survive, and to make sure others don't have to suffer as I did." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was immense. The Apache woman sat in silence, reflecting on everything he had said. She didn't know what the future held for either of them, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel as alone as she once had. There was something about this man, this enemy-turned-unexpected companion, that made her believe that maybe, just maybe, there was hope, even in the harshest of places. The night grew colder, but she didn't mind. There was warmth between them, an unspoken understanding that, for now, was enough. It was a fragile thing, but it was there, and that was all she needed to hold on to for the moment. The days seemed to stretch on endlessly, and yet there was a quiet shift in the air. The Apache woman could feel it, though she didn't yet fully understand it. The desert had a way of making everything feel both timeless and fragile. Each moment could be both fleeting and eternal, depending on how you looked at it. Her body had healed, and though there was still some discomfort, the raw pain of her injuries had mostly faded. But there was another kind of change happening inside her, a shift that went deeper than her physical recovery. She had grown accustomed to the presence of the man who had captured her. He had become a constant, his actions no longer cold and distant, but rather filled with purpose and care. He didn't ask for anything in return, and his actions had slowly carved a path through the wall she had built around her heart. She found herself looking at him differently now. His quiet strength, the way he moved with such grace and calm, the way he watched over her without demanding anything. It was all so different from what she had expected. She had prepared herself for cruelty, for harsh treatment, but instead she had received something else. His kindness had crept up on her, and now it was a presence in her life she could not ignore. But with this growing connection there was also fear. Fear of what this new bond meant. Fear of what it might cost her in the long run. She had been taught to trust no one, especially not those who had taken her people's land, their homes, their lives. The man beside her, no matter how kind, still represented that loss, that devastation. Could she trust him? Or was he just another enemy, wearing a mask of kindness to deceive her? She found herself torn between the life she had known and this strange new possibility. The man's presence was both a comfort and a complication. The more she got to know him, the harder it became to reconcile the man before her with the enemy she had always been taught to hate. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the cool night air wrapping around them like a blanket, the silence between them felt heavier than usual. She could feel the unspoken tension hanging in the air, and it made her restless. She needed to speak, needed to ask the questions that had been weighing on her heart. "You've said you've lost everything," she began, her voice soft but steady. "But why did you save me?"
You didn't have to. You could have left me to die like everyone else.
The man was silent for a long moment. She could see the flicker of the firelight reflecting off his face, his expression unreadable. His dark eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw something deeper in them, a quiet sorrow that mirrored her own. "I've seen death up close," he said quietly, his voice low but clear. "Too many times. I've lost people I loved, people I thought I would always have with me. I don't want to see anyone suffer if I can do something about it." His words hit her harder than she expected. She had heard many speak of loss before, but there was something in the way he said it that made her realize how deeply it had affected him. He wasn't just talking about survival. He was talking about the part of him that had died with each loss, the part that would never come back.
I don't want to be the reason anyone else has to suffer, he continued.
"I don't want to add to the pain. I know what it's like to lose everything, and I don't want anyone to go through that if I can stop it." His words were simple, but they resonated with her in a way she couldn't explain. She had spent so much of her life trying to protect herself from the pain of loss. But here he was, a man who had lost everything, offering her kindness instead of vengeance, offering her hope instead of despair. She didn't know how to process it, how to make sense of this change. "But you're not the same," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You're not like the others. Why not just let me go then? If you don't want to cause more pain, why not set me free?" The question hung in the air between them, and for a moment the man didn't respond. She watched him closely, waiting for an answer, but he seemed lost in thought, as though he was weighing something deep within himself. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "Because you're not a prisoner anymore?" he said softly. "Not to me. I've seen enough pain to last a lifetime. I don't want you to live like I did, feeling like there's no way out. There's always a way forward, even if it's hard to see." The word struck her in a way she couldn't quite understand. She had always believed that survival meant fighting back, resisting with everything she had. But here he was, telling her that sometimes survival meant letting go of the past and accepting that things could be different. That change was possible, even in the harshest of places. For the first time in a long while, the Apache woman allowed herself to feel something other than fear or anger. She felt a flicker of hope, a small light that broke through the darkness of her heart. Could it be possible that there was a future for her? A future that didn't involve constant fighting and running? A future where she wasn't bound by her past? Her mind raced as she thought about it, but her heart seemed to know the answer before she did. There was no going back. She couldn't stay in the world she had come from. She couldn't stay in the pain and anger that had defined her for so long. But what was ahead of her? What did the future hold, if not more loss, more heartache? She didn't know. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid to find out. The fire crackled between them, and the man's steady presence beside her felt like a quiet promise. Maybe they didn't have all the answers. Maybe they couldn't predict the future. But for now, they had each other, and that, she realized, was enough. As the night grew darker and the fire burned low, the Apache woman felt a shift inside her. She had always thought that survival was about holding on, about never letting go of what you had. But now, she saw that survival could also mean letting go of the past, of the things that weighed you down, and finding a way to move forward. Maybe it wasn't about winning or losing. Maybe it was about learning to live again. The wind blew softly, carrying the scent of the desert night with it. The stars above them twinkled, bright and distant, a reminder that no matter how small their place in the world, they were part of something much bigger, something timeless. For the first time in a long while, the Apache woman felt at peace. Not because everything was perfect, not because the past had been erased, but because she was finally ready to move forward. And beside her, the man who had once been her captor, her enemy, was now a companion. A man who had shown her that even in the darkest of places there could be light. She wasn't sure what the future would bring, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid of it. The days passed slowly, but for the first time in a long while, the Apache woman didn't feel the constant burden of dread weighing down her every step. The fire that had once burned with a fierce and unyielding rage inside her heart had begun to cool, replaced by a quiet understanding of herself and the world around her. Jay still didn't have all the answers, and there were still many questions left unanswered, but she felt a shift within her, a shift that allowed her to look at the future with a new perspective. Her days with the man who had once been her captor now felt different. He had become something more than just a companion. He had become the person who had shown her kindness when she had expected none, who had cared for her when she had thought there was no one left to care. In the beginning, she had only seen him as an enemy, someone to fear, but now she saw the quiet strength in him that mirrored her own. They were both survivors, shaped by loss and hardship, and yet here they were, finding a way to move forward together. As the sun set on another quiet evening, the Apache woman found herself sitting beside him once more. They had built a routine together, one that was simple but comforting. He would gather firewood, and she would help prepare the small meals they shared. They spent long hours in silence, but there was a peacefulness in their companionship that she had never experienced before. The man never asked her to explain herself, never pushed her to reveal more than she was ready to share. And in return, she did the same for him. They simply existed together, without judgment or expectation. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the man turned to her, his gaze steady and thoughtful. There was a calmness in his eyes now, a quiet acceptance of the life they had made together in the desert. It was a life of simplicity, far removed from the violence and chaos they had once known. "I know you've been thinking about your future," he said quietly, his voice carrying a softness that surprised her. "I don't know what it will look like, but I think it's time you decide for yourself. You don't have to stay here with me. You don't owe me anything." His words caught her off guard, and for a moment she didn't know how to respond. It wasn't what she had expected. For so long she had felt like she was at the mercy of fate, like she had no control over her own life. But now, in the stillness of the desert night, he was offering her something she hadn't even realized she wanted: choice. He had spent so much of her life fighting, resisting, holding on to what little control she had left, but now, for the first time, she realized that the future wasn't something that was handed to her. It was something she could shape, something she could decide for herself. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of insincerity, but there was none. He was offering her freedom, the freedom to choose her own path. The thought was both terrifying and liberating. "I don't know what I want," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I know I can't go back to what I was. I can't live the way I did before." The man nodded, as if he had expected her answer, and in some way it seemed to bring a sense of peace to him. He didn't want her to stay out of obligation, but because she chose to. That was the freedom he had been offering her, the freedom to make her own decisions, to find her own way. "I'm not asking you to stay," he said, his voice steady. "I'm asking you to choose what you want, whether that's here with me or somewhere else. I'll support you, no matter what you decide." His words were simple, but they carried a weight of understanding that touched something deep inside her. For so long she had been a prisoner to her circumstances, to the pain of her past, to the expectations of others. But now, for the first time, she realized that she had the power to choose her future. She didn't have to be defined by what had happened to her. She could carve out a new path for herself, one that was hers and hers alone. The desert stretched out before them, vast and empty, but in that emptiness she saw possibilities. She saw a future that wasn't bound by the past, a future where she could make her own decisions, where she could decide who she wanted to be. The fire crackled softly between them, the warmth from the flames casting flickering shadows on their faces. She thought of the life she had once known, the life filled with violence and loss. She thought of the years spent fighting to survive, of the people she had lost along the way. And then she thought of the man beside her, the man who had once been her captor, but who had become her companion, her protector and her friend. She realized then that her journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. There was still so much more to learn, so much more to experience. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew that it was hers to shape. I think I want to stay, she said, the words coming out more clearly than she expected. I want to learn more. About myself, about you, about this place. I don't know what the future holds, but I want to find out. The man smiled at her, and for the first time she saw a lightness in him, a relief that mirrored her own. They didn't need to have all the answers. They didn't need to know exactly what the future would look like. What mattered was that they were choosing to face it together, whatever it might bring. The night stretched on, the stars above them shining brightly in the dark sky. The world around them seemed still, but in that stillness there was a quiet promise. A promise of something new, something unknown, and something full of possibilities. They sat together in the silence, no longer bound by the past, no longer prisoners of their circumstances. They were free, in the truest sense of the word. Free to choose, free to dream, free to shape the future in their own way. And for the first time, the Apache woman felt the weight of her past lift, replaced by the quiet hope of a future she could create. It wasn't going to be easy, but she was ready. With him by her side, she knew that anything was possible. The fire burned low, the night stretched on, and as the desert winds whispered through the quiet night, they sat side by side, ready to face whatever the future would bring, together.